Our goal is ultimately to address the glaring divide between what we know about FH, which really is an incredible amount, and what we do about FH.
We thought it was a solvable problem because it was caused by a single gene mutation. We knew from the genetics that there was one gene that was causing this whole thing, one mutant gene. You know, genetics, medical research is like looking for a needle in a haystack. But if you work on a single gene disease, then you know that there's a needle in that haystack. And you know there's only one needle in that haystack. And so all you have to do is find the one needle and you're done.
Mike Brown and I were asked to write an editorial in Science on to outline the progress and promise of research in coronary disease in the preceding 20th century. And we entitled our editorial Heart Attacks Gone with the Century and a question mark. And we deliberately chose this title to be provocative. And remember, this was in 1996. Our aim was to challenge scientists to abandon bandwagon research on tired topics in favor of pursuing new areas in a more original, intense, and passionate way. And it's gratifying to us that in the 20 years since this editorial was written, one totally new approach that no one envisioned, anti-PCSK9 therapy, suddenly emerged 10 years ago. And if coronary disease is to be ultimately prevented, we need more out-of-the-blue discoveries of the PCSK9 type. So 100 years from now, when historians write about medicine in the 21st century, hopefully the chapter on atherosclerosis will be entitled Heart Attacks Gone with the Century with no question mark.
PCSK9 is pro-protein convertase subtle lysine kicks in type 9, so for obvious reasons will be referred to by its contraction. It's expressed in the liver, the small intestine, the kidneys, and the brain. And it came to attention in the lipid field when it was associated with, when mutations in PCSK9 were associated with a genetic form of hypercholesterolemia that looked very much like FH. We can show using genetics that PCSK9 should be an efficacious and safe therapeutic target.
We still don't understand many of the aspects that are downstream of LDL receptor binding to PCSK9. What we do know, of course, by work of Brown and Goldstein and many others, is that the LDL receptor normally recycles. So it binds LDL, it's internalized, it goes back to the cell surface so it can bind more LDL molecules. Something occurs when PCSK9 binds that actually prevents this recycling. And so once PCSK9 binds to the LDL receptor, it actually goes to the endosome, ultimately to the lysosome, where the LDL receptor itself is degraded. How and why that targeting and differential movement of the LDL receptor occurs still isn't exactly known, and again is an area of future study.
You know, we would like to cure atherosclerosis while we're at it. If you dramatically lower the LDL cholesterol down to about 20, you can completely regress early atherosclerosis. If the plaque is more advanced and fibrotic and calcified, the best you can do is stabilize it. But you can completely regress early atherosclerosis and normalize vascular function. So the hope would be, let's try this in people. It looks like it may be enhanced with functional HDL and various other things. So that would be really neat, and that would be something certainly applicable to our young FH patients if we could completely normalize their disease and maintain them long term then.
When you start to look at genomics, biotechnology, and the opportunities of personalized medicine, and this incredible speed to develop novel therapies, it turns out there's a greater cost of goods. So the expense is high, and what is that going to mean? The cost to the consumers and the payers is high.
We know for many, many years that certainly the higher the LDL levels, the greater the risk of cardiovascular events. But at any rate, we know there's heterogeneity in this risk because it's not only cholesterol, it's also the other factors that also might contribute to the onset of cardiovascular disease in those individuals.
In a standard of care setting, you know what the problems are, which is as you start discussing with the patient about genetic counseling, right there on the moment, you add 15 minutes if you're lucky. But it could be more like 30 minutes, right? And this is not the genetic counseling. This is the teaching and education of the patient of what genetic testing is all about before they start thinking about it, before you give them websites to study, including yours, which I give to everybody. Right? Then you need to have access to a clinical geneticist. I don't know you do business, but if you try to order genetic testing and you do it yourself, I don't know, Jamie, if you do it yourself, but you increase the risk of being denied by a lot. So using a genetic counselor increases the insurance coverage.
We know from experience that we motivate the patients after genetic testing to adhere to therapy and to get better control over their life. And you also have a great amount of relief in those patients or family members that do not prove to have FH. But the bottom line of genetic testing is that if you have this high-risk patient here with lots of risk factors and you want to improve therapy or optimize therapy, this is in many cases difficult. On the other hand, if you have information about the genes and know which parent donated what gene to the child, it all becomes much clearer.
This debate is part of our commitment to look at all sides of the genetic testing issue and how it can serve our joint goals to improve patient care. Undoubtedly, the FH Foundation sees the great promise and value in genetic testing for the condition. However, speaking on behalf of the FH community, we do have these following concerns that need to be voiced.
I've been given a second chance and more time to spend with the people who I love. As for me and my kids, it's all about lowering our LDL levels in hopes of having as much time together as we can. In the near future, I do believe genetic testing for FH can play a larger role in early detection and for optimal treatments. As this technology develops, it too will be a powerful tool in giving many people many more years of life to spend with the ones that they love as well.
For every disease, earlier diagnosis, earlier intervention, earlier treatment leads to better outcomes. This seems like the perfect disease to see that. But if we don't find all the families soon, we're not going to have that opportunity in the kids today.
This is data from the Cascade FH registry that shows by the time these patients end up in the lipid centers is relatively late in life, and a diagnosis occurs relatively late. And you're looking at 30 years of plaque buildup, and that's just too long. Clinicians are going to start looking more for FH in their practice because our model has good indication that there are individuals with FH in every county in the United States, and most of those counties have a much higher prevalence than most clinicians think there are now.
We can also say from the modeling project and from the pooled cohorts that the FH phenotype is indeed associated with increased CHD mortality in the United States and morbidity, and that the relative risk is really quite high for young adults. We can see that the FH phenotype, particularly high LDL lifelong, leads to cardiovascular aging and accelerates your cardiovascular risk 10 to 20 years if you're a man and 20 to 30 years if you are a woman. And I think these findings and the fact that they are from US cohorts gives us something to talk about with our patients and families as we're counseling them about FH.
On your left, you see heterozygous FH and prevalence of cardiovascular disease, so myocardial infarction, CABG, coronary artery bypass graft, PCI. 14% of patients at enrollment have PCI. 4% have aortic stenosis, certainly higher than what you'd expect from the general population, and something that we know is a risk factor in FH. What you can also see here is that coronary disease, myocardial infarction, PCI, they're all common. Premature cardiovascular disease is very common. You start to see big signals for this in the 31 to 45 age range.
Tier 1 applications are those that are supported by evidence-based guidelines and that can actually save lives. And we have a few examples of them. Newborn screening is the biggest public health genetics program in the world, but FH is on that list.
Then a 1% reduction in LDL cholesterol translates to a 3% reduction in risk rather than a 1%, as we would see in clinical trials. So this is a great challenge for future guidelines, how we're going to be able to integrate this concept into guidelines that can be accepted by evidence-based folks. But I think the data is quite strong to support this and is an approach that we need to take, and the sooner the better in my view.
And if you model some of the adult trials, you can see that you can reduce event rates, but based on the age at which people enter the studies, the event rates are only reduced by a certain amount, and there's substantial residual disease. And for me, residual risk is just atherosclerosis you aren't able to treat or obliterate. So our idea was that if you start at a younger age when atherosclerosis was less developed, you could treat and regress that atherosclerosis so you had essentially a healthy vessel. And if you were extraordinarily successful, you actually could stop treatment for a period of time. When the atherosclerosis came back, you treat again in these intermittent cycles. The data on outcomes or safety is certainly informative, but we also now know, thanks to these genetic epi studies, that the risk of having the gene is about 3 to 1. And let's get real about that. That is the same risk ratio for smoking, right? It's exactly the same.
Maybe as a broad theme for this meeting, we must find and treat all families living with FH.
You have to think about it. The genetic testing is actually not the genetic testing for the patient. Genetic testing is for families.
The great challenge to us always is access to those treatments. And not only here in the US, but especially in developing countries.
So there's this issue of not only treating people more effectively, but starting earlier. And I think that looking at things like the registry, along with these other opportunities, will be effective for both finding and treating.